to my SIPA Speaks talk, especially during finals week. You're all my true friends, so it's wonderful. I'm really excited to talk about a number of things today. My background, why I came to SIPA, some of the focus of my career, and research I want to do in the future. So I'll get started and we can kind of dive right in. So my presentation is about the link between financial crime and financial inclusion. And of course, my name is David Sperry. I'm a first-year MIA concentrating in economic and political development. So these are the things we'll discuss today. My background and why I came to SIPA, as I mentioned. What is financial intelligence and how is it used to investigate financial crime? What are some of the unintended consequences that come from this process? How do these unintended consequences affect financial inclusion? And what policy changes can be made to improve this process for everyone involved? So a little about me. That's me. My mom made me a Charmeleon outfit when I was 7. That is me. I'm from Massachusetts originally. I grew up just north of Boston, kind of around like Salem area. So, is there a pointer? Oh, there is. That's exciting. I don't know if this is working. I don't think it is. So this is one of my favorite maps of Massachusetts because it labels everything like colloquially. So there's a couple of really funny ones in here, but I'm from this section that's called Witches, Fishermen, and Quaint-Ass Towns. So that's where I'm from. So sort of some background on my interests as in my career and academically. So I've always been interested in mysteries and scavenger hunts and investigations from a really young age. I was really into Scooby-Doo.
Yes.
Really into Carmen Sandiego, the CD-ROM game, the original. Really great. And so I kind of fell into this area of work. So I went to NYU for undergrad. I was in the Gallatin School of Individualized Study, which is basically a make-your-own major program where you sort of design your own curriculum around a set of specific topics that they call your concentration. And mine was called the Socioeconomics of Behavior, which basically looked at how individuals and societies make decisions based on economics. So it's kind of like a version of behavioral economics, but it was really cool because I was able to combine sociology classes and economics classes and a few other things thrown in there to really have a great experience. But my interest in financial crime didn't really develop until I interned in government a bit, and then also when I did my thesis for my undergraduate degree. So my undergrad thesis looked at perceptions of the 2008 financial crisis and how they differed among regulators and students. And so just looking at, how did people conceive of what happened, and then also how did people understand the policies that were passed afterwards, both to address it primarily, but then also to address the effects. And I interned for Senator Warren, which was super cool. It just got me really into this sort of financial crime world. Then after graduation, I joined the New York Attorney General's office. So when I was there, that was my first experience with oh, you can be a financial analyst and investigate financial crimes for a job. And so I was like, this is super cool, which I didn't really know. Well, I knew that people were investigating the crimes, but I didn't really know that this was something that I could do as a career path. So when I was there, I was investigating mostly securities fraud, insurance fraud, and employment fraud. So people who pretended to be a doctor but weren't, and a lot of Wall Street related crimes. And then I was really lucky. I had a contact who worked at the El Dorado Financial Crimes Task Force, which is basically an interagency task force that involves the Department of Homeland Security and a bunch of like state level agencies that all investigate financial crime. And they have a unit called the New York HIFCA, which eventually hired me. And basically I joined them as a Senior Financial Intelligence Analyst in 2017. And so my work kind of changed a little bit because that office was more focused on federal money laundering crimes. So I was investigating money laundering, and I still am now because I'm still working there. I was investigating money laundering associated with human trafficking and drug trafficking and public corruption and in some cases terrorism. So just a disclaimer, anything I say is my opinion alone and not the opinion of the Department of Homeland Security or anybody that employs me. But I am still working there and I really, really enjoy it. The stuff that I investigate tends to be really interesting. Each different typology kind of comes across in the financial data differently. So it's a really fascinating and dynamic place to work. And I get to work with a lot of agencies doing a lot of different things. So I work with people who investigate tax crimes and people who are focused on benefit fraud or people who are focused on seizing homes and cars that are purchased with the proceeds of illegal activity. So it's really interesting, really cool place. Oops. So why SIPA? So I love the process of investigations, but I actually love public policy more, which I know we all love public policy. So I was like, oh, I really want to move back towards that. I didn't really see law enforcement as my long-term goal. And you know, in the law enforcement field, there's a lot of people who like that is their long-term goal. They want to become either U.S. attorneys or agents or what have you with one of the three-letter agencies, but that's just like not necessarily my my interest. So I wanted to get back into policy. I also think that there's a lot of different people with different backgrounds, and I'm excited about like how they will influence my ideas about what I do, and also how I might influence theirs. So I was kind of excited for that exchange. And then also, like, not so exciting, but also exciting, is I have a lot of concerns about the way that we detect financial crime and how that impacts international development. And I think that both the people who are investigating financial crime and the people who are trying to make strides in international development aren't really talking to each other about those issues. And so I was like, oh wow, there's a really interesting niche here where I can sort of study these issues and give a wider lens. But what do I actually do? So when I go to work, there's three basic things that I do. One is use financial intelligence to conduct criminal investigations. So I'm assigned investigations to investigate from higher ups who've already started them. So they'll come to me and be like, hey, we're doing a human trafficking investigation. We'd like you to look into the financial side of the targets we're investigating. The other thing that I do, which I think is more fun, is look for financial intelligence to start new investigations. So and as we'll talk about in this presentation, I go into the financial crime databases that we have, look for interesting targets, things that could be built into bigger cases, and then basically write up intelligence reports to give to the higher ups at the agency and say, hey, you should investigate this. And sometimes they investigate it and sometimes they don't. And it's kind of interesting because like a lot of factors go into play about what's going to be investigated and what's not. But I find that to be the most interesting thing that I do. And then we also work with financial institutions to make the information sharing between us better. So like financial institutions, as you'll see, play a really big role in the financial intelligence generation process, but there's not a lot of communication between people working at banks and people working in law enforcement. And so it can be kind of an opaque process where they're like, oh, we identified this weird thing that our customer did, but like, I don't know if anybody did anything about it. And so we kind of try to like give them feedback of like, okay, so this was good, like this was a good example of something that we saw that you did that we liked. So this is some general, to give you a lay of the land of like where my sort of unit is within, the federal government. So I'm part of New York HIFCA. There are 7 HIFCA jurisdictions around the country, and HIFCA stands for High Intensity Financial Crime Area. A lot of acronyms today. So the HIFCA, this is a map of all the different HIFCAs. So the blue is just like the rest of the US, but this is our HIFCA, the New York HIFCA. There's a Chicago HIFCA, there's a South Florida HIFCA, which is very active because a lot of drug investigations. There's also a Southwest border region, and then NorCal and SoCal. So these were put in place, I believe, by statute, I think around 2001, but I don't know the exact statute that put them in place, but it had to do with, the ramping up of anti-terror investigations after 9/11. So the other thing is, this is the El Dorado Task Force. So, how I was talking about all the different agencies that are that I work with. So this is all of them, all their SEALs, hanging out together. and so it's a really dynamic place. It's really cool. We do a lot of interesting work. Oops. But what is financial intelligence? So I think it's important, it was important to start with this because I think it helps you understand, okay, what are we talking about when we talk about the information that's being shared between banks and law enforcement to investigate financial crime. So my sort of loose definition is information about the conduct of financial services customers collected and utilized to investigate and prosecute financial crimes. So here's a little bit of history regarding financial intelligence. So we started collecting this information in the 1970s, essentially because of the mob. So a lot of times, they would be involved with banks who, would help them launder money. And since there were no reporting requirements, they didn't report it to the government. So we had a lot of problems with dirty money throughout the financial system. So in 1970, they put in place the Bank Secrecy Act, which is still kind of the crown jewel of the anti-money laundering system in the US. And so basically, it created these monetary reporting thresholds where, if you, try to cash more than $10,000, they're like, where'd you get that? What'd you do? And basically, it's meant to identify what's deemed suspicious activity that appears to circumvent the thresholds. This was updated after 9/11 through the USA Patriot Act. So the USA Patriot Act is this huge kind of nebulous piece of policy that has a lot of parts to it, but there's a very strong anti-money laundering part. And so basically it created more stringent rules, and it said that all financial institutions had to have an anti-money laundering program. It also created the database that I was talking about earlier that I use to get financial intelligence, which is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, another acronym that I'm going to talk about and call FinCEN throughout this presentation. So if I say FinCEN, I'm talking about the database. And so that database was put in place so that the banks could upload the intelligence that they find through monitoring their own customers, and then the government could use that intelligence to benefit investigations. So how does the system operate? I've talked about financial intelligence, I've talked about how the banks create it, but how does it operationally work? So you have a customer, he's like, I'm gonna do some transaction, and basically, let's say that the transaction is illicit. Or is suspicious in some way. The bank, or any financial institution for that matter, will likely flag that transaction and say, hey, this was weird, let's look into this a little bit more, let's write a report about it. So they'll write a report. The report follows a specific template, basically, and then it's sent to FinCEN, which is that database, and then all the law enforcement agencies have access to FinCEN. So we can go in and see, oh, this bank filed this report on this person I'm investigating. Let me read it, let me see what they said. So these reports tend to be not super lengthy. They tend to be very specific and look at a specific span of activity during a specific time period. So it'll say oh, between these months, you know, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. This is why we think it's suspicious. Here you go. And so basically we'll take that and either start an investigation like I was talking about earlier, or it aids in what we're already investigating. So the FinCEN database is only accessible to law enforcement users, as I was saying, and disseminating any of the customer information found in it is a federal crime. So anything that, you know, that's involved in the FinCEN portal, anything that's actually on there about customers is illegal to disclose to anybody. So it kind of creates some more privacy to the system, so there's only certain people who can view the information, and there's penalties for people leaking that information. Actually, like last year, there was someone who was prosecuted under this for leaking a suspicious activity report about Paul Manafort. So it was like a big deal. You guys can look it up. It's kind of an interesting tidbit. And another important thing to note is FinCEN reports, particularly SARs, which are suspicious activity reports, merely identify potential suspicious activity, and they're not permissible for use in court. So I can't be like, I found this SAR on the database, and therefore you committed this crime. Like really, what you have to do is you're using this as a tip to create your wider investigation, and then to, you know, subpoena documents, find other information that you can use to sort of flesh out the story that you're trying to tell in an indictment. So what does this look like? So there's a bunch of different reports that are in the system. So when you search somebody, you know, a bunch of different stuff will come up, depending upon, you know, what they've done in the past. So the most kind of like innocuous common one is the currency transaction report, and that's the one that's triggered when anybody deposits over $10,000. So like, that's not necessarily criminal, it's just like, they deposited $10,000, interesting. We should report that to the government. So it's kind of a compliance standard. Sort of the bulk of the reports that are of interest to law enforcement are the suspicious activity reports. And those are basically, you know, have all the same information of a currency transaction report, but have this extra section called a narrative, where the banks write in, this is what we think happened, this is what they did, you know, this is who they talked to, you know, whatever. And so those are like the most important for law enforcement. And then you have two more down here in 8300, which that's when it's filed by a business when anybody purchases anything with cash above a certain threshold. So like, if I went to a Maserati dealership and was like, hey, take this suitcase full of cash and I'll take that Maserati, and they sell it, they have to report all the information about me to the government, because that's suspicious. And then the final one, which is kind of interesting, which is the foreign bank account report, or the FBAR. And these are all also acronyms that like people within the financial crime community will use a lot. So the FBAR is basically filed by individuals. So whenever you do your taxes, it'll be like, do you have any foreign bank accounts you want to report? And so you're responsible for reporting that you have a foreign bank account, and also the amount of money that was in that account at the time that you're filing your taxes. So like, it's kind of a really weird standard, because you think like, oh, the government wants to know like if you have accounts, but it wouldn't want to rely on people to self-report their, you know, their foreign bank accounts. Wouldn't you want to like just detect the foreign bank accounts yourself? Which the government hasn't gotten there yet, so unfortunately no. So it's helpful in so much as, you know, we can see, oh, this person reported a bunch of foreign bank accounts, but you know, it doesn't really help us identify all of their accounts, because it's a self-reporting mechanism. So what does this intelligence actually look like in like a written form? So this is like a CTR, a blank CTR form. So I actually couldn't find a blank SAR form. I know they exist, they're like on the internet. And all this information I'm talking about is public, so like don't, you know, you can look it up, you can, you know, search. But basically, you know, you have biographical information, so like your name, your date of birth, your social security number, all that kind of information. The address on your account, a lot of personal stuff that you give the bank when you open an account. So it's not like they're like giving them stuff that you didn't give them, you know? And then the transaction information, so if it's an actual CTR like this report, they will give like, oh, how much was deposited, how much was withdrawn. For SAR, typically the transaction information will say, you know, how much was deposited, how much was withdrawn, and then also like what kind of illicit activity they think it is. So like they have a lot of different like designations for like, oh, we think this is this, we think this is that. And that's something I'm gonna get into later is like, how do they figure out what it is? How do they designate, you know, all that kind of stuff. So just know that that's a field that exists. Identifying the conduct, like I was saying, and then the narrative, which is only on the SARs, and basically is self-explanatory, a narrative of whatever the person did. So by the numbers, this is kind of to give you guys an understanding of the scope of how many, you know, SARs are filed. This is also public information. If you go to like finson.gov, you can like see, you know, how many SARs were filed of different types. So this is just depository institutions. So there's any financial institution in the country is supposed to have an AML program, anti-money laundering program. So like this is just for, you know, a commercial bank that you go and deposit money into, whereas, you know, investment companies also have to file these. You know, insurance companies have to file them. So it's a large group of reports, but this is the bulk of them, which is the deposit reports. This is the amount that was filed in New York State. And something that's kind of interesting is that we don't know how many were utilized to start investigations because of the secrecy rules. So it's kind of like, we don't know how effective these are. Or internally they might know at FinCEN, but they don't widely circulate that information. So how would I use this information as an investigator? So the narratives can be really helpful when identifying specific typologies. So like in the report, usually the bank will be like, well, we think it's this. And then I'll be like, okay, interesting. Like, let me read further, let me look further at their other activity to see if I can sort of corroborate that. The financial information will also have account numbers, which can be useful to sort of build webs and relationships. So like, when I'm investigating, you know, I'll have like a bunch of reports on different people that are connected in certain ways. And like, if you can identify the account numbers and kind of match all that information up, it can be helpful to build a case. The other thing is that FinCEN contains reports from all financial institutions. So like, let's say Bank of America filed a report on somebody. Usually, when someone's committing financial crime, they don't only have one checking account. They have like 5 or like however many. And so Bank of America might file something and be like, this is what I think is happening. And then let's say like TD Bank files something. And they're like, this is what I think is happening. And so like obviously those two banks haven't talked to each other because that's like proprietary information. But you can kind of be like, as an investigator, oh, you know, this is what they thought this was. But actually, now that I've read this other person's report from this other bank, I can kind of like hash out what actually happened. So it's kind of an interesting, you know, an interesting tool because of the way that, you know, the information is collected. But what do I do with it? So essentially, you have the original report. So of course, I read the report. And then the process to sort of use it in an investigative setting, or get the raw material, which is like the actual accounts and the actual, you know, bank information of the person that I'm looking into, would be to read the report, request the underlying documents for the bank. So for each intelligence report that's in the database, there's underlying bank documents, usually like a couple of pages of statements, or like some check images, or like wire, you know, pages. And so they might send that to me as like a snapshot of the account if I request it as a law enforcement like entity, and they'll be like, hey, this is what it's based on. But of course, you know, that's a limited scope of what is actually, you know, going on in the account. I don't have the full account. So usually, if I look at the underlying documents and I like what I see, and I'm like, okay, cool, you know, I could continue, you know, investigating this. Then I would go to the U.S. attorney I'm working with. So I work on a team with a U.S. attorney, an agent, and then me, the analyst. So the U.S. attorney is the one who does all the legal things. So I can go to them and be like, hey, I would like to subpoena this account. And then, you know, they get it signed by the court, they legally command to subpoena this account. And then I finally get the information at the end, which is the actual raw data. So we've legally commanded the bank to produce this information to us on this customer. I can then read through it, I can analyze it. I do a lot of work with Excel and pivot tables to analyze people's accounts. But that's sort of like how you get off the ground running on a money laundering investigation, and other financial crimes too, but mostly money laundering. So that's sort of like how I operationally use this information. So as you guys can probably understand by now, it's a very risk-based system, which I think has strengths and a lot of weaknesses. So international organizations have kind of been instrumental in implementing this system around the world. So the US has FinCEN, but a lot of other countries around the world have their own financial intelligence units, FIUs. And so they operate on a similar basis because the US is kind of a template. And so the international organizations have kind of incentivized this risk-based model to investigate the activity. And so the risks that they identify, to kind of generate a report are what I've been talking about, generally as we've, been going through the presentation. So the nature of the financial activity, the country of origin of the transaction, the nationality of the individual, public information and records on the individual that the bank can find, and then just like the arbitrary judgment of the financial institution itself, which I'm not excited about. So the objective of the system is to quickly identify the crime and address it. And so the idea is that all these leads are going to turn into potential investigations. But the thing is there's so many reports, there's only so few law enforcement officers to investigate them, and it takes a lot of time and money to do an investigation into financial stuff. So it kind of, it doesn't play out necessarily in the way that, people and policymakers might want it to. The other thing is that, the suspicious activity, because the banks, want to kind of cover their own liability about customers who are doing something illegal, they have a tendency to be like, oh, that was a weird thing they did, I'm just gonna close their account. Because I don't wanna mess with someone potentially, moving money for an international, transnational crime unit. I don't wanna have issues with that. So the banks, do a lot of things out of an abundance of caution. So these are some of the financial organizations, the international organizations that deal with financial intelligence. The two most important ones, I think, are FATF and the Egmont Group. So FATF is the Financial Action Task Force, and so that's housed within the OECD, and they create a lot of anti-money laundering rules. So, they're like, oh, we designate all these countries as risky, or in different levels of risk, and for different reasons. And then the Egmont Group is another group of financial intelligence units, also has, rules it passes, guidelines, and kind of the way that it's like a lot of other international organizations where developing economies kind of want to become part of one of these, because then, it spurs investment and people want to come to your country and do business and all that kind of stuff. So, it's a very similar situation where developing economies want to be associated with these sort of gold standard groups. So I think that, I kind of want to pivot a little bit and, question the risk-based system a little bit and ask sort of, is this paying off and who's it paying off for? So when I've been investigating, I've seen some problems with the system that are kind of based on, I'll talk about, in detail, but kind of based on, externalities that are created by the way that we collect the intelligence. And I think there's ways to minimize these externalities without actually, having a negative impact on how many people we investigate or identifying terrorism or anything like that. And I think that, we should make those changes. So these are the problems that I sort of identified with the risk paradigm. And I think these all have, varying levels of impact and in some settings, some of them aren't true, but some of them are. Not each of these applies to every report, but as I go through them, you'll kind of understand what I'm talking about. So one problem is subjectivity. So the narratives